What's up, everybody? We are here to get started with Chapter 6 of our European history class. Chapter 6, we're still talking about the Romans, but now we're moving from the Republic era into the Imperial era. We had just, with the last video, we killed off Julius Caesar, and then you have the Roman world split into the East and the West, held by Caesar's adopted son, who was actually his great nephew, Octavian, and one of Caesar's closest assistants, Mark Antony. Now, Octavian and Antony did not like each other. They didn't trust each other. And while they did have an agreement, they helped each other hunt down Caesar's assassins. And then it was really both sides just plotting against the other to gain control of, Caesar's estate, gain control of the Roman world. And in the end, Octavian ends up winning out. Octavian will end up taking the title of Augustus, or actually have the title bestowed upon him. Even though Octavian or Augustus Caesar is considered the first emperor of Rome, he never called himself emperor. He had another title, which I'll talk about here in a little bit, that he preferred to go by, even if others start to refer to him as emperor. But you would end up seeing the successors of Augustus down the line, members of the Julio-Claudian line, refer to the title holder as imperator or emperor. Now, in 27 BC, after 31 BC, the Battle of Actium, Augustus ends up taking control, driving Mark Antony and Cleopatra back to Egypt, where they die shortly thereafter. But once Mark Antony is out of the picture, Octavian, he controls all of Rome now. Over the next few years, he's already putting this system in place where Rome is still a republic, at least on the surface. But Augustus is making changes beneath the surface that little by little he's moving Rome even farther away from its republican roots, to the point where, again, on the surface, all of the assemblies are still in place, the Senate's still in place. He is serving as consul. He never took the title like Julius Caesar did. Octavian never took the title of dictator. He always served as consul. His entire rule, he held the title of consul. Now, things do end up changing in 23 BC, where he gives up the consulship. But again, he still controlled the government, because he gives up the consulship, which would have given him imperium, power to rule. But he gets the Senate to grant him, as a retired consul, Maius Imperium, greater imperium, which meant that he could, his word outranked even that of the consuls. He was also given the power of a tribune without actually holding the title, or without actually being elected to that office. So he was able to propose legislation. He was also, he had the powers, he could out-trump consuls. If consuls voted to veto legislation or voted to approve legislation, he could veto them, and it would end up carrying more weight. It would be like if, well, now we are at the beginning of December in 2020, it would be like President Donald Trump will end up leaving office in late January. President-elect Joe Biden would end up taking over as president. It would be like if Congress passed a an amendment to the Constitution, not just passing of a law, amending the Constitution to say, if granted by the Senate, that a exiting president still has the power of veto, and his power is even supreme over a sitting president. It's honestly kind of ridiculous, and it just shows how Octavian ends up setting up this situation where there's this facade, there's this illusion of democracy and republic, but Octavian controls everything. He has greater authority than any of the elected magistrates. He has the power of certain elected positions without holding those positions. And, more or less, he's beloved by the people. He didn't have nearly as many just rabid enemies as his adopted father Julius Caesar had. Getting back on track, though, after he defeats Mark Antony and Cleopatra, he assumes total control. Basically, he is stepping right into the role that Julius Caesar had held prior, but he's not calling himself a dictator. He is one of the consuls of the Roman Senate. 27 BC, he proclaims his victories against Antony had restored the Republic. So here he is presenting that image, that illusion is being set that the Republic is restored. Now, he knew that the Republic would never be able to go back to the way it was at the height of the Republican era, 300 BC, 250 BC. So he figures out a way, like I say, he worked to find a compromise. He keeps referring to Rome as a republic. He keeps the assemblies in place. He keeps the Senate in place. But he's calling all the shots. It's kind of like if you've ever watched the movie The Wizard of Oz. He's like the Wizard of Oz. There's the illusion, the big head, projected to anybody that goes into the Oz's courtroom. But pay no attention to the little man behind the curtain. Well, Augustus is the man behind the curtain. He's pulling all the levers. He's working all the knobs and buttons, even though you have this illusion of the old Republican government still functioning and in place. Now, the Senate granted him the title of Augustus, and that's how we know him. That's how the people of Rome referred to him, the rest of his life. Augustus actually means the revered one. He preferred a title, a title of his own choosing was princeps, which meant first among equals. Augustus, like I said, he of course lived a very comfortable life. All the wealth he inherited from Julius Caesar, all the political power that he had. He, like Caesar, again, he learned everything from Julius Caesar. He understood that image, the way that the public perceive you, is extremely important. He, when given the opportunity, used the title of princeps, first among equals, basically, again, to project the image that he was no different than any other Roman citizen, that while he may be consul, while he may be the revered one, he considers himself equal to a common farmer that lived, out in rural part of the Republic, as opposed to Augustus, who lives, in a palatial estate there in the city of Rome. Behind closed doors, he lived a fairly, you might even go as far as to say, a boring life. He didn't buy into the pomp and circumstance that very easily could have become his calling card. behind closed doors. He lived, even though he was, for lack of a better term, emperor. Again, he never called himself emperor. It was a title that was applied later, but he was the first absolute ruler of this imperial era. But he lived very plainly, almost, behind closed doors. He didn't wear fancy robes, fancy clothing. He ate a very bland diet. He didn't indulge in a lot of extravagant things. Now, the title of princeps, again, because he wanted this equal, first among equals, he wanted it to project an image that he was no different. And what happens is you've got a situation where the title itself conveyed no power. 23 BC, he gives up the consulship, which had given him imperium. But after 23 BC, after he steps down from the consulship, the Senate grants him Maius Imperium, greater imperium. So he has even more authority. He has even more power at this point. Like I said, this is also when he gains the power of a tribune without actually holding the office, able to propose legislation. He's able to veto any piece of legislation. Now, officials continue to be elected. Again, this is where the whole illusion of the democratic republic is held in place. People are still elected to the plebeian assembly or plebeian council. People are still elected to the centurion assembly. Seats within the Senate that are vacated continue to be filled. Consuls are elected, proconsuls, equines are placed on the courts. But Augustus could do anything. I mean, his word was law. But as the Roman people saw, the Roman Republic was continuing to function like it had at its height. But in reality, behind that curtain, Augustus was running everything. As time goes on, as years and years pass, because Augustus ruled until the year 14 AD, people know by this point that no, this isn't the Republic of, Tiberius Gracchus. Involvement in elections start to decline. People felt like their vote didn't matter anymore. They knew their vote didn't matter because Augustus, it didn't matter who they elected into the different magisterial offices or to the different popular assemblies, because Augustus ends up making all the decisions. It was still, like I said, you still had the popular assemblies, but it was a case where really holding a seat in the plebeian assembly or the centurion assembly, it was like an honorary title. You would go to work, you would meet when the assemblies were called into session, but you didn't do anything because you didn't have any real authority. During this time, you have general peace throughout the empire. So the army doesn't have a great deal to do during this time period. They go from being a conquering force to more of a police force throughout the empire. The security of the princeps, it depended on the army. It depended on a loyal army. Now, the army, like I said, they become more of a police force during peacetime because they weren't fighting abroad in barbarian lands to bring more territory into the Roman Empire. The standing army at this time was 28 legions. A legion consisted of 5,400 soldiers. Out of those 28 legions, that would give you around 150,000 total troops. 150,000 strong army by modern terms isn't huge, but it's definitely nothing to sneeze at. And yes, they could have called up reserves and swelled the numbers from that 150,000, but 150,000 isn't large by modern military terms or for the size of the Roman Empire, even at that point. And the Roman Empire has time to expand a great deal. You have 50 million total people living within the Roman Empire. 150,000 troops to defend all that territory wasn't that much, especially when you consider that you had hostile territories along, basically surrounding your borders. In modern times, you might not need a very large standing army because, you might be generally on peaceful terms with all of your neighbors. The Romans didn't have that situation because throughout the later part of the Republic, the Romans had been conquerors. That put them on shaky ground with a lot of their neighboring territories. Legionnaires served for 20-year stints at this point. Remember, I talked about during the time of Marius, they served for 2 years, before Marius, they served 2-year terms. Then it gets extended to 6-year terms. Well, now by the time we get into the early empire, people that served in the Roman legions, you signed on, that was your career. If you were brought into the Roman legion, you were going to be a soldier for most of your adult life. You served for 20 years. You could continue to serve after those 20 years, but once you joined the military, you were in the military for the next 2 decades. Members of the legions were only recruited from citizenry, and under Augustus, this would change under latter emperors, but under Augustus, he primarily pulled recruits from the Italian mainland. He tended not to want, Augustus, he tried to build up, today we would refer to it as nationalistic pride, but, he tried to build pride in Rome, in the heritage of the Roman Republic, and the Italian people, the people of the various ethnic groups of the Italian peninsula made up the backbone of the old republic. Now, as time goes on and we start getting into the rule of later emperors, they do, because they need to increase the size, the numbers of the military, they do start pulling recruits from Spain, from North Africa, from Gaul, from Germania. It just depends on which Roman ruler you're talking about at the time. Some, and that's the thing, is whoever the emperor is, they're the ones that are going to be calling the shots. So if you have one who, like Augustus, wants to focus on generating Italian pride, then they might only recruit soldiers from Italy itself, or Italy and 1 or 2 other regions of the empire. Other emperors that are just worried about raising the numbers and increasing the size of the army, they might pull from anywhere. They might not worry about citizens or citizenship. Now, auxiliaries, you had about 130,000. They were not considered part of the legion, but they were used by the Roman military to fight, to serve as scouts, to serve as guides, especially when you're on the frontier of the empire and it's territory that they're familiar with that the Roman legions might not be. These auxiliaries were not citizens. They served 24-year terms, and when a non-citizen finished their tour in the Roman legions or with the legions, then they and their families would receive citizenship after they finished their tour. Then, and that was a huge attractor. That helped with recruitment of these non-citizens, because you, sir, you might look at it, yes, that's, you're risking your life, and there's no guarantee that you're going to make it 24 years, but you make it through your 24 years of service, and you, your wife, your children, their children are guaranteed citizenship. and all of the rights and benefits that come along with that. And in most cases, that that enticed a lot of people, and it drew loyalty from these non-Romans that they might not have had otherwise. It doesn't mean that there weren't non-citizens that betrayed the legions. That definitely happened, but that promise of citizenship for you and for future generations of your family, that was enough to keep a lot of these non-Romans loyal to the Roman government, to the military. I'd mentioned the Praetorian Guard earlier, talking about Julius Caesar. Like I said, the Praetorian Guard, for the different magistrates, elected officials in the Roman government, they were a simple way of describing them is it would be like they would be the Secret Service in the United States government today. Well, now you have Augustus. You have 9,000 Praetorians, and they were the best of the best. They were tasked with protecting the princeps. Now, that doesn't mean that everywhere he went, 9,000 soldiers went with him. You would still have some that would be assigned to important senators, to the magistrates that were still elected, even if their powers didn't amount to much, because again, you have to keep up that image, the appearance of the republic. But you would have Praetorians, because Augustus had more than one home. He had country estates and things like that. So you would have some soldiers some Praetorians that were part of his everyday security detail. You would have some that worked at the Senate. Basically, anywhere that the emperor would go, you had guards that would protect different members of the princeps family. Praetorians were recruited only from Italian citizens, and they served 16-year tours. So you might sign up for the Legion, serve 4 or 5 years with distinction, or maybe 10 years. And if you got recruited from the army into the Praetorian Guard, you were signing up for 16 years of protecting the emperor. As time goes on, the Praetorian Guard ends up becoming arguably the most powerful group in Imperial Rome, especially when you're looking at the fact that they're the ones that are charged with protecting the emperor. Well, it eventually gets around to the point that at different points in imperial history, especially later in the empire's history, before the fall of Rome, the leaders of the Praetorian Guard were actually the ones that selected the next emperor. And also, if there was a cruel emperor or an inefficient emperor, or one who just did not fit well with the leadership or the mindset of the leaders of the Praetorian Guard, that emperor might get assassinated, because maybe the guards that were placed on duty, maybe they went down the hall. Maybe they went down the hall to check on a noise that they heard, and while they were gone, somebody killed the emperor in his sleep. So again, political assassinations were, I wouldn't say they happened every day, but they were not uncommon in Roman history. Now, at different points in time, victorious generals were hailed or cheered as imperator. The way it would translate to us would be emperor. We refer to Augustus as the first emperor of Rome, but like I said, he never used that title. It didn't become common as the title for the Roman ruler until Vespasian took the throne in 69 AD. And from this point now, once we get past Augustus, we will be out of the BC years. So anytime you see a year, like up here at this top bullet, where it doesn't say AD or BC, if it down here it says BC, well, we're referring to that. I go from 9 BC to AD 9. I do that just to differentiate that years have passed here. But Once we get past Augustus, any dates you see, they won't have an BC or an AD. We are in, if you look at chronological order as a number line and the birth of Christ in terms of our chronological ordering is 0 on the number line. After we get past Augustus, we're going to be on the positive side of the number line. So I'm not going to use AD in front of the years after this point. But this chapter is where we'll get to the point where you won't be seeing BC and AD all the time. Now, in terms of the provinces and frontiers, because, the empire or the republic had grown greatly, especially in that last century or so of the republic, Augustus really didn't push to expand the borders. It's not to say that there weren't pieces of territory that were added to the Roman Empire during this time, but that wasn't a major push to expand the empire. Under Augustus, provincial governors, they received a salary where they didn't during the Republican era. Again, Augustus was a very shrewd, he wasn't so much a politician, as he was an autocrat, an autocratic ruler, but he understood by studying history, by listening to, Julius Caesar, how corrupt the provinces were. And again, I talked about that before, the proconsuls and the propraetors that end up getting sent to the provinces. It was easy for them to extort money, to steal money from the republic, as they collected taxes to turn over to Rome. They just would keep more than their share. And, that's one of the reasons that, the Senate had been willing to allow that, because those politicians had been deemed too dangerous to stay in Rome. So they let them go to the provinces, to the far reaches of the republic, or now the far reaches of the empire, and let them do whatever just to keep them out of the Senate's hair. Well, now under Augustus, he had no tolerance for corruption, and he understands the best way to keep the provincial governors loyal and as honest as possible is to pay them a good salary, pay them regularly, so they're not as apt to steal. But then you also have people under them that are also well paid, that in turn will keep an eye on the governors. And if they start breaking laws, if they start acting in a shady, corrupt manner, they'll turn in the proconsul to the Senate, and then that person will be removed from their position. So, that was one thing Augustus really wanted to do, is crack down on the corruption that had started to fester over the last 150 years in the Roman Republic. Another thing is that, the governors didn't have many assistants. So again, he had to pay them to make sure that they stayed honest. Since there weren't many assistants to serve the provincial governors, you start to see an expansion of the policy of working with local people of influence. Whatever region this province was comprised of, if it was Spanish, if it was Gaul, and talking about the Franks, or the Gauls before the Franks, you've got a situation where you're going to have to find locals, natives that you can trust and that are willing to work with the Romans, and you put them in positions of power. And you, at the same time, you also want to find ones that the local population is willing to listen to. Give the locals a degree of self-government, have the local officials answer to Roman provincial officials, but let the locals do most of the day-to-day running of things, and that's going to reduce the amount of resistance that they run into in terms of a smooth running of the Republic, of the empire at large. That was a problem that they had run into in the Republic period, is they tried to make the entire power structure Roman, And that's something that the natives, they would resent being ruled over by foreigners. But if you allow the native population to work into the existing power structure, you're going to see less. It's not to say that there wouldn't be resistance, but you'd see less resistance. By the time you get to 15 BC, Augustus had been looking to expand to the north. That first 15, 16 years, he was focused on securing his power, his authority, and ferreting out problems that he had been seeing for years in Rome. When you get into the latter half of his rule, that's when he starts to consider expanding. By 9 BC, he had reached the Elbe River in eastern Germany. 18 years later, by the year 9, General Verus lost 3 legions, 16,200 soldiers, something like that, after a massacre led by one of the auxiliaries, Arminius. He was a Germanic tribal leader. He had been serving the Romans as a scout. He had gained his citizenship. But it was one of those things where he resented the Romans from where he had fought against them when they conquered that part, Germania, and had probably been forced into service initially. He faked, he faked loyalty to the Roman army until he had time to set up this ambush and allow the various Germanic tribes that the Romans had been fighting against a chance to set up, a coalition to fight against the Romans. Arminius, as one of their main scouts, led them into this ambush, and like I said, 3 legions end up being decimated. Which, anytime you hear somebody use the term decimated, that actually comes from Roman military defeats. To be decimated means that you were defeated, you were massacred to such an extent that you lost 90% of your soldiers. Your army was reduced to only 10% of its starting numbers. Decimated, like decimal, like deca, 10. Now, after Verus's defeat, Augustus decides that we need to pump the brakes. We need to slow down advancing into Central Europe. Again, we can more greatly secure our holdings in Gaul, in Spain, mid-Central Europe, but after this defeat, they back off, pushing into Northern Europe too far. Now, Roman historians completely blame Verus for the defeat, not Arminius for betraying. I mean, basically, later Roman historians' view is that Verus made bad decisions. He trusted Arminius too much. Despite being a Roman citizen, Arminius was still Germanic and leading legions in Germanic territory. They're saying Verus was too careless, and that Verus should have still been suspicious to Arminius, despite the fact that there's nothing to really indicate that Arminius would have led them to believe that he was going to betray the Romans. It's a lot of the blame falls on the general because he was absolutely embarrassed. This was a huge embarrassment, for a huge setback for the entire empire. It embarrassed the emperor. But the historians tend to blame Verus as opposed to the Germanic traitor. And it's one of those things, it's kind of like in sports. When the team loses, yeah, you might have individuals on ESPN or whatever that are breaking down how the game went, and oh well, the quarterback didn't play well, or the running back fumbled the ball twice, or in basketball the point guard had 6 turnovers. But in the end, who gets the blame? Basketball. If the Los Angeles Lakers end up losing the NBA championship, is LeBron James going to take all the blame? I mean, there's going to be some people that might blame him or the way he played, or Anthony Davis, or whoever's on the team. But when push comes to shove, the first person to get blamed in a lot of cases, or the first person to lose their job, is going to be the coach. When an army is defeated, the person that makes all the calls or oversees the running of the army, the general, is the one that's going to take all the blame. Now, in terms of society under the rule of Augustus, he changes the way that Roman society is structured. Now, people that hold seats in the Senate, which by the time Augustus comes into power, there were 1,000 senators in the Roman Senate. What he does is he creates requirements, something that outside of you had to be a descendant of the original 300 senators when Rome became a republic to be eligible for one of those seats if something opened up, and then it gets expanded to 600 to 900 to 1,000. One thing that Augustus does is he wants to turn the Senate into a ruling aristocratic class. So to be eligible for the Senate under Augustus, you had to own 1 million sesterces of property to be considered a member of the senatorial class and to be eligible for a seat in the Senate. Another thing he does to increase the prestige, he felt like adding more seats to the Senate, which, the reason that Julius Caesar did it, the reason that Gaius Gracchus did it, was to placate important people in society. But the way Augustus looked at it, by adding seats to the Senate, it lessens the value, it lessens the prestige of being what's more prestigious, saying that you're one of 1,000 or that you're one of only 600? I mean, that 600 is still a lot, but that sounds better, that sounds more important than being one out of 1,000. So he reduced the number of people that actually held a seat in the Senate, but by creating this requirement that says 1 million sesterces of property puts you in the senatorial class and makes you eligible to serve in the Senate, that added a lot of new families from all across Italy, not just in Rome and the surrounding farmland. The equestrian order was expanded during this time period. He opens up the equestrian order to all Roman citizens that were in good standing, and to be considered an equestrian, you had to own 400,000 sesterces worth of property. You could hold military and political offices, but those offices, those positions were all less important than the positions that were open to members of the senatorial class. At the end of an equestrian's career, they might, not guaranteed, but they could be awarded a membership in the senatorial class, elevating their entire family if they served with distinction during their career as an equestrian, military official, political official. Now, if you didn't belong to the senatorial class or the equestrian class, you were just part of the lower class. You were part of the mob. The majority of the population ends up being a member of the lower class, the common people. Just because you were a commoner in the eyes of the emperor, in the eyes of the government as a whole, didn't mean that you had no authority, but at best, a commoner might hold a basic local official position. You're not going to see a member of the lower class being named a judge on the jury courts, not going to be holding a position of a quaestor, a praetor, a consul. Also, this is really when you start to see welfare programs. They existed before this point, but you really see them adopted in multiple places. Up until this point, you might have just seen them more so in Rome, but you start to see things where members of the lower class, people that came from unskilled labor positions, they're given free grain because that's very important that the people have enough food. If they don't have money and they don't have food and life is just getting by as a struggle, you're opening yourself up to revolution, to revolt. So make sure that even if the people aren't well paid, make sure that they have free food. Again, that also creates the feeling that my life is hard, but the government is taking care of me. The emperor cares about me. Also, for the common people, you start having these festivals, these events referred to as spectacles. Public spectacles. In a lot of cases, you would have, if you had to pay for food and stuff like that, it would be relatively cheap, but you would have free games. You would have, gladiatorial games, chariot races, events of that nature, and it would be like an extra holiday, and it might last for 3 days. It might last for a week. It might be a festival that lasts for 2 weeks, and what it does is it gives the hardworking, poor, lower class members of society a chance to party, time when they don't have to just break their backs working, and they get to indulge themselves. It's also a way to kind of get them to forget how bad their day-to-day life might be, and it keeps them happy for a time period. So when the festival comes to an end, there's much less complaint about going off and doing the crap work that they end up having to do on a day-to-day basis. And then after a period of time, it's time for another public spectacle to take place, and it gives the people another break. As long as you can keep the favor of the people, keep them placated, you don't have to worry about revolts. Now, again, Augustus was big on wiping out corruption. While he knew that he couldn't restore the republic as it had been centuries before, he does want to restore traditional Roman values. He does create, I refer to it as the imperial cult, to strengthen the tie between religion and the state. He never claimed to be a god. You did have Roman emperors after Augustus that claimed to be a god or the direct descendant of a god. You even had one god that climbed to the top of the palace and tried to fight Jupiter, the king of the gods, or demanded that he be allowed entrance to Mount Olympia. Now, he allowed the veneration of Julius Caesar as a deity or a god. He allowed the building of temples to himself, Augustus, and Rome or Roma. When he dies, while he never claimed to be a god, he never called for the veneration of himself as a deity like his adopted father. The Senate voted to deify Augustus when he died in the year 14. Now, Augustus believed during the time period that Rome fell into decline and eventually the Republic collapsed, he blamed a lot of that on moral corruption during the late Republic. He starts, since he could introduce legislation by himself without a popular assembly, he creates social legislation to enact things that the way he saw it would slow or decline that moral decay. He felt that luxury had undermined Roman morality, that especially the upper class, the wealthy, they overindulged, whether in a lot of immoral things. That's why he lived a very plain life. He didn't dress in fancy clothing. He didn't eat, he didn't eat rare exotic foods. He ate a very plain, very bland diet. Honestly, if you saw him behind closed doors, according to historical accounts, you may have had trouble recognizing that he was the sole ruler of Rome. Uh, he also blamed some of that moral decline of the republic on the ease of divorce. Because it was so easy to get divorced in the late republic, and even when they didn't get divorced, you had too many Roman families that had only married for political gain, for convenience, and that's the only reason that they stayed married. Husband and wife didn't love each other, and because both of them may be having affairs, or they split as husband and wife, you see a decline in birth rate in the upper class. All these different things, whether they did actually play a role in the fall of the republic, this is what Augustus blamed on the fall of the republic. So through his social legislation, he makes divorce nearly impossible in terms of hedonistic behavior and excessive spending, showing off your wealth. He starts passing laws that place financial limits on how much you can spend on a banquet, on a party. And you would have to file paperwork, and you would have to, if questioned by a government official, you'd have to be able to prove how much you spent on a party, a banquet that you had. Adultery, cheating on your spouse, ends up, becoming a crime. If you get caught, you could be fined, you could be imprisoned. Tax laws penalized being unmarried, having small families. It would be like giving tax credits to people to get, which we actually do in the United States. You get tax breaks for being married. You get tax breaks, or you get, it adds to your tax refund the more children, the more dependents that you have. These were all things that Augustus did to try to strengthen the Roman family. And he didn't pull any punches. He treated his family the same. The emperor's family, the royal family, was not above these laws. His daughter was caught in a scandal, which I'll talk about in more detail later. And he exiled his own daughter from Rome for adultery. And that hurt him very badly. But at the same time, he wasn't, since he is supposed to be equal to every other citizen as princeps, first among equals, he can't treat his daughter any differently than any other citizen that broke some of these laws. So as much as it hurt him, he did exile his own daughter from the capital. Now, in terms of, this is considered the golden age of literature in the Roman civilization. Not to say that they didn't have great literary figures in the Republican period, but Augustus also patronizes writers. He seeks out talented writers, and he wants them to use their skills with the written word to glorify Rome, to glorify this society that he's trying to create. So if he sees someone that displays a great deal of talent, he's going to bring them into the fold. He's going to pay them well to promote. I mean, you can look at it like marketing. He's paying them to write literary pieces that are going to promote his republic, which technically was really his empire. Virgil is looked at as probably the greatest of all the Roman poets. The Aeneid is considered his greatest work. It is an epic poem, on par with the Iliad, the Odyssey, Beowulf, the Epic of Gilgamesh. And even if parts of it are fictional, it's an epic poem about the founding of Rome. Again, it doesn't start off with Rome being, a collection of little fishing villages that just organically grow into each other and eventually become a major urban area. Rome was great from the very beginning, that sort of thing. It's something to build national pride among Roman citizens. Horace lived from 65 BC. It's kind of sketchy, historical records vary, but most records account for him dying around the year 8 BC, but we're not entirely certain because there are some discrepancies that have been found. He's best known for writing the Odes. The Odes actually came in 4 volumes, 4 books of poems about various subjects in Roman society. Of course, the things that he's writing about, he either promotes the traits that Augustus is trying to promote, and he writes poems denigrating the traits that Augustus blames for the decline of Roman morals. Things like sexual immorality, greed, laziness, job dissatisfaction. I mean, at times everybody's dissatisfied with their job, but this is more of a, you should be thankful for the lot you have. If you don't have much, be glad for what you've got. Don't worry about what you don't have. Probably Horace's most famous poem out of the entire 4 books would be in Odes 1, number 11, where he talks about carpe diem, seize the day. I don't know if he still does, but Mr. O'Reilly used to have a coffee mug, not the great big thermos that he carries around a lot now, but he used to have a coffee mug that had carpe diem all over it. But carpe diem means seize the day. Now, he also wrote a collection of short stories called satires, which again were meant to point out faults in Roman society. He didn't call out individuals in particular, he called out traits. He called out trends in Roman society that were deemed by Augustus to be damaging. Now, Ovid, I said I'd bring up Augustus's daughter a little bit ago. Ovid was a popular poet. He was a member of the upper class. He was a member of the senatorial class. And he also cared very little for Augustus's moral policies. He ends up becoming friends with Augustus's daughter. And as he starts to find his voice, since he was a friend of the emperor's daughter, the emperor supported Ovid initially. Then Ovid ends up promoting basically the exact opposite of what Augustus was, the agenda Augustus was trying to push. The Art of Love was a collection of lewd, very explicit stories and poems. He and his closest friends, the emperor's daughter was one of them, they end up getting caught being involved in more or less an orgy. That's where the scandal comes from. And because Ovid had published this book of lewd stories that, again, were the most immoral thing that Augustus could have thought of at the time and went directly against the legislation that he was pushing, Augustus asked him to denounce that book. And stop writing stories and poems like that. Ovid refused. And when that happens, it's one of those things where, since he was a friend of his daughter's, Augustus tried to cut him a break, but when he refused to do the emperor's bidding, well, then he made his decision right there. Ovid ends up being implicated in the exact same scandal that caused the emperor's daughter to be exiled from the city of Rome. He never returns to Rome the rest of his life. He dies in exile in a small town on the coast of the Black Sea. I mean, he was driven out of Italy, not just out of the city of Rome. He ended up in the far eastern reaches of the empire, and that's where he stayed until the day he died. Livy, he was another one of the great well-known writers of this time period, the late reign of Augustus. He did exactly what Virgil did. He did the exact thing that the emperor wanted. He celebrated the greatness of Rome. And of course, the more he celebrated these Roman traditions and Roman morality that Augustus was pushing, the more Augustus made sure that Livy's work was elevated and passed throughout the empire. His masterpiece was a history of Rome from the foundation up to 9 BC. So you'd look at it like a recent history book. 142 total volumes. Only 35 of Livy's works have survived. Another thing, it's kind of like when we talked about Herodotus in the Greek chapters. He was considered a historian. This was considered the most expansive history of Rome ever written in the culture, but he wasn't overly concerned with the historical accuracy of his statements. It was meant to be a good story, and it was meant to be a story that glorified the traits that the emperor wanted. He was a good storyteller.
There's a little table set over by the lunchroom towards the end of the like you would for the lunch line. We've got some snacks.
Sorry about that. Had to mute the mic while the announcement was being made. Let me pull my notes back up. Now, like I said, despite the flaws that Livy's history has, his work remains the standard for Roman history for generations throughout the Roman civilization and really into early medieval civilization. Modern historians would still go back and look at Livy's work because he was contemporary to the early imperial time. He lived in the late Republic, the very end of the Republic, and the early imperial period. He died 3 years after Augustus died. And it's going to be medieval historians like Gibbons would end up looking back to what Livy did. Modern historians would look back on Gibbons and Livy. Now, the early empire, from the death of, this is where the empire of Rome really gets set. Because like I said, the whole time Augustus was in power, he never called himself emperor, but he was controlling an empire. Augustus, like I said, had a daughter. No one ever opposed his choice as successor, Tiberius. What this does, when he chooses the person who will inherit his power, this establishes a dynastic line, the Julio-Claudian line. And this means that the descendants trace back to the blood of Julius and Claudia, his wife. Tiberius ruled from the year 14 until the year 37. He was Augustus's stepson, adopted son. Tiberius was adequate. He was a competent general, nothing spectacular. He was an able administrator, again, nothing spectacular. He didn't do anything to be an absolute embarrassment, but he also didn't do anything to really endear him to historians. He tried to get the Senate more involved, which, like I said, even senatorial seats had become more of just marks of prestige that had no real power. Caligula took over after Tiberius's death. He was the great grandson of Augustus. Caligula only ruled for 4 years. He was tyrannical. He was erratic. even as emperor, he was considered a bit of a pervert. And by most accounts, he had some sort of mental issues, as far as going to call him insane. Eventually, he meets his death at the hands of his Praetorian Guard because as a ruler, he was too erratic. Claudius ends up taking over for Caligula after his death. He was the great nephew. And again, Claudius is looked at as a very competent ruler. Out of the Julio-Claudian line, he's probably the most effective emperor after Augustus. He did have physical disabilities, but he was very well educated, and again, he was an effective ruler. When he dies in the year 54, though, he is replaced by Nero, who, if they thought Caligula was bad, Nero really took the cake. He ruled for 14 years. He was a spoiled child that inherits the throne of Rome, and he grows into adulthood as a spoiled young man. He was neglectful of the military. He didn't care anything about military service. Where Julius Caesar had been a military man, someone who walked in the military and the political world. The same thing with Augustus. At the age of 19, he was leading armies. Nero, no. Nero was what you might see in terms of the son of wealthy business owners, or the children, of celebrities, movie stars, musicians, whatever, that they've grown up with everything that they wanted. Well, you put that person in the position of the emperor, the supreme ruler of a kingdom, and they can do, their word is law. They can do whatever they want. Nero was also extremely cutthroat. He would eliminate anybody that stood in his way. People's lives were like toys for him to play with. At one point, he wanted to build a new palace, and what happens is he's looking at a map of Rome, and he's like, I think this would be a perfect area for the new palace to be. And one of his advisors was noted as saying is, sir, there are apartments in that neighborhood. And Nero was like, who cares? I'm the emperor. This is where I want construction to start on the new palace. Mysteriously enough, within a couple of weeks, a fire starts in that neighborhood. And at this point in history, you did have apartment buildings that would be, several stories high, 3-4 stories, maybe 5 stories. The infrastructure was completely made out of wood. And after these buildings were, 10, 20 years old, the entire internal support structure of the building, it was like a book of matches. If a lamp gets knocked over here, or if a straw fire starts there, the entire building's going to go up before anything could be done to put it out. And according to the rumors, Nero stood on his balcony and played the violin while he watched that part of the city burn. And a lot of Romans, and it could have just been an accident, but a lot of Roman people spread the rumor that the emperor set that fire. Because as soon as the rubble was cleared out, they did start construction of new buildings there. He became emperor at the age of 16. He was actually tutored by the famous Stoic philosopher Seneca. As time goes on, Seneca stayed on with the young emperor as an advisor. As soon as he becomes emperor, and again, he had the attention span of a fly. He becomes interested in anything and everything except for ruling. He fashioned himself as an actor, as a great musician, as a great singer, horse racer, anything other than being a good leader for the Roman people. He gets on really bad terms with the Senate and the Roman people by making certain prominent, popular figures that defied him disappear. a very popular general, so that put him on bad standing with the military. It's suspected that he may have even played a role in the death of his own mother. Anybody that seemed to be a political impediment to his wishes met an untimely fate. He even had Seneca commit suicide. His tutor for years, someone he had known since childhood, Seneca as a Stoic. Stoics didn't have any compunction against taking their own life, especially if it fell in the line of upholding your duty to the society. Well, since Seneca directly served the emperor of Rome, to defy one of the emperor's orders would have gone against his whole personal philosophy as a Stoic, where you serve the state, even if it means giving your life. And Nero ordered Seneca. He's like, as a Stoic, you've taught me that there's no compunction against taking one's own life. He said, kind of like, I want to see if you can practice what you preach. And he ordered him to take his own life. And of course, Seneca didn't want to, but at the same time, to hold to his beliefs, he took his own life. And apparently Nero was just kind of like, he actually didn't. I didn't think he'd do it. And it just rolled off like water off a duck's back. In the year 68, there ends up being a riot, a revolt in Rome, and his personal guard, he was hated by everybody. His personal guard, who were sworn to protect the emperor with their own lives, they abandoned him in the middle of the revolt. Without protection, Nero knew that he was detested by the Roman people, important, influential people, and the common people. And while there's rioting in the streets, instead of allowing some of his enemies to find him and do whatever they wanted with him, he chose to stab himself in the throat and commit suicide himself. Now, that was the end of the Julio-Claudian line. The next ruling family ends up being the Flavian line that ruled from the year 69 until the year 96. Now, when Nero dies without a successor, that leads to a civil war breaking out. It was the end of a dynastic line, so you end up having several families trying to make a power grab. Galba ends up replacing Nero. He ends up being overthrown by Otho. Vitellius ends up overthrowing Otho. And then Vespasian ends up driving Vitellius off the throne. This was known as the Year of Four Emperors. You have one emperor commit suicide. You have three others assassinated until Vespasian ends up gaining control, and he ends up ruling for 10 years. Now, with the Flavians, this is when you see the official drop of the title of princeps. The Flavians, they choose the title of imperator, emperor. They do not consider themselves first among equals. They are above the rest of Rome. Now, when Vespasian ends up taking the throne, this is the first time that you had a emperor that was not from Julius Caesar's bloodline. It doesn't mean that he was bad. It was just something different that the Roman citizens were going to have to adjust to. He did reform the economy after Nero's reign, which was a disaster. Of course, the civil wars after Nero's death do even more to damage the Roman economy. And Vespasian does a great deal to put things back on track. Now, he ends up naming his son Titus. Titus only rules from the year 79 until 81. And then when Titus dies, Domitian ends up becoming the emperor, and he ends up ruling for 15 years. But when Domitian, he didn't have a direct descendant to hand the title to. So when he dies, he ends up being replaced by Nerva. Now, during the rule of the five good emperors, you have nearly a century of peace. This is during a period referred to as the Pax Romana, or the Roman peace, where you don't have any revolts, you don't have any major problems, and there's no war going on in the boundaries of the Roman Empire. The five good emperors were absolute monarchs. They held total power, but they were all looked at as benevolent. They were all looked at as good for the Roman people. Nerva did not rule very long. He was chosen by the Senate in the year 96 to succeed Domitian, but he was an old man when he was named emperor, and he did not last very long. Knowing that he was an old man and he himself didn't have a son to pass the title to and start a new dynastic line, he ends up adopting Trajan to have an heir to hand the title off to. So Marcus Ulpius Nerva Trajan ends up succeeding Nerva when he dies in the year 98. Again, Trajan did not have a direct male descendant to hand the title to, so his second cousin, which in terms of a title changing hands, that's not a close relative for the title to jump to, a second cousin. That would be, just to put it in perspective, if my father has a cousin, then that man would be my second cousin. You don't have, we've had a string here of several Roman rulers in a row that didn't have a direct male descendant to hand the title to. So it wasn't uncommon for important, whether they were politicians or whether they were just wealthy businessmen, wealthy landowners, to name, to officially adopt another man, so you had someone that could inherit your estate after your death, because the way that Roman society was structured, it was male led, and if all you had were females, then if all you had were daughters, then you could have a male that was some relation to that woman come in and claim ownership of the land or the business or whatever, and Roman courts may have allowed that. So that's why it becomes a practice to see these individuals that only had daughters adopt someone to make them, even if it was a nephew, adopt a nephew, bring them into the direct line of succession. Now, Hadrian, as a ruler, he didn't hang around Rome a whole lot. He traveled extensively. He traveled all throughout his empire. It's like he wanted to know every corner of the land that he ruled over. He was also known as a great builder. He paid for a lot of temples, a lot of monuments. He built Hadrian's Wall in the British Isles to separate Roman territory in the south from barbarian land in the north. He built the Parthenon, which is still to this day considered the greatest temple in Rome. Hadrian ends up adopting Antoninus Pius, and he ends up ruling from 138 to 161. Antoninus is considered the most productive out of the five good emperors. Now, unlike Hadrian, Antoninus, he chose to stay close to home, and he makes great use of the Senate, leans on them very heavily to help him in his rule. It's probably one of the reasons why he's considered one of the great emperors of that early age. Again, without an heir, and yes, I just noticed the typo down here. Wow, I can't even spell again. Again, without an heir, you see Pius end up adopting Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius rules for 19 years, and he was very educated. He's considered by many, and he also considered himself, he strove to be a philosopher king like Plato wrote about. He was a Stoic. and he authored his own book, Meditations. And the whole purpose behind Meditations was to explain how a Stoic would rule. One of the things about Stoicism is you're not supposed to covet personal power. Well, as Emperor of Rome, that's also something that you have to strive for. That's something that you have to, hold on to, not just let someone take your power from you. So a lot of Meditations, he muses on, the conflict inside him about being a Stoic, but and the things that Stoics believed in, or the things that Stoics believed you should try to avoid. But the conflict within him, because as the Emperor of Rome, he also had to do what was best for Rome. And he did live, personally, he did live a life that was very conflicted as emperor. Now, that's where I'm going to stop this video. We'll pick up with frontiers and provinces in the next video, and I will talk to you all soon.